Hello, good morning to all of you. So wonderful to be back here again with all of you. So, I want to begin by saying the big thank you to each and every one of you who watched it live and who are watching the recordings, and also to all my wonderful children who've signed up for our online summer camp. You know that, right? You can join that camp at any day, at any point, from anywhere across the world. And also a big thank you to all the parents who've been leaving us such lovely feedback. I'm so happy that you are enjoying this, right? So, last time, you remember whom we met? Mr. Topsy Turvy. Today, oh, by the way, did you talk in that topsy turvy way last time? I hope you did. And did you have fun? You can leave comments for us in the comment box, and even those of you interested in the online camp, do leave your email ID, and we'll get back to you. All right, now today I'm going to introduce you to somebody else. Remember, it's all a silly story session, nothing else but silly funny stories. So today we are going to meet somebody new. You know who he is? This person whom we're going to meet new. He's called Mr. Noisy. So you know what Mr. Noisy will do? Of course, make a lot of noise. Let's see what he's doing, all right? Okay. So Mr. Noisy was a very noisy person indeed. For example, if Mr. Noisy was reading this story to you, you know how he would read? Hello, everybody! Oh my God, this is how he would talk because he's Mr. Noisy. And they said his voice was so loud that you could hear it 100 miles away. Oh my goodness. And for example, when people sneeze, how do they sneeze? Oh, hush! Correct? But imagine if Mr. Noisy was sneezing. Do you know how he would sneeze? Achoo! Oh my God. Not only he, but everybody around him would be startled and say, what's happening? But that's Mr. Noisy for you, okay? Now, Mr. Noisy lived in this town, which was called Wobble Town, because it would wobble, shake with Mr. Noisy's loud noises. And he lived on top of the hill. There are not so many pictures today, but I'll show you what I can. Can you see this? On top of the hill is Mr. Noisy's house. All right, and then he would sleep and he would snore. Hmm. Can you imagine what his snores would be like? His snores would wake up everybody. People in Wobbletown couldn't sleep. Why? Because Mr. Noisy was snoring. Goodness gracious me. That almost would sound like elephants walking or rhinoceros doing some stuff. That was Mr. Noisy. Everybody was so tired and they would not sleep well at night because there is Mr. Noisy snoring on top of his voice. But then they didn't know what to do. To get up in the morning, he would put his alarm clock so that he could get up in time. But his alarm clock wouldn't go. No. You know how it went. Ding! Oh, not only he, but everybody around in Wobbletown would be shaking. That's how Mr. Noisy would get up in the morning. And then he would go for a walk. He would say, I think I should buy myself a loaf of bread so that I can, have some sandwiches or toast for breakfast. And he would go open the door of his house. Tong! One loud noise. And then when he would go outside, how do you do that? When you go outside, you shut the door gently. But not Mr. Noisy. He would step outside his house. With all his might, he would bang the door shut. Bang! And that's how the door would shut. And everybody knew Mr. Noisy was going to be out. And then he would walk. And you know how he walked? He didn't walk like how you and I walk. How would he walk? His shoes would make that sound. clump, 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 walking. And everybody knew that Mr. Noisy is out shopping. And they said that he would make so much noise walking that even the birds would fly away in fear, like, oh my God, what's all this noise? And the birds would be flying all over the place. And then he would walk down the hill. You remember? He stays on top of the hill. He would walk down the hill, going clump, clump, clump. And he would go to the bakery, to the baker's shop. Mrs. Crumbs was the baker. And guess how he would talk to her? First, he would open the door. Down, shut it, bam. And then he would ask her. He would talk to her. What does he want? He wants a loaf of bread. How would you say it if you went to a baker and you wanted something? You and I would say, can I have a loaf of bread, please? That's how you and I would say. But we are talking about Mr. Noisy. How do you think Mr. Noisy would say? Can I please have a loaf of bread? Mrs. Crumbs would shake and then say, here, here you go. Please take it. And then Mr. Noisy would look at her and say, thank you. Okay, Mrs. Crumbs. And then he would go. And then he would walk down the street, go clump, 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 and crash this door and just walk around. And then he would go to the butcher's because he said, oh, I want to eat some meat sandwich. And he would go to the butcher's and then he would ask for some meat. Of course, you know how he would ask. I would like a piece of meat. Mr. Bacon would tremble and hand him the packet. Okay, here you go. Oh no, and would hope in his heart of hearts that Mr. Noisy will not say thank you because you know how its thank you would sound. Thank you! All right, okay, I'm safe till next morning because Mr. Noisy is not going to come back. And then Mr. Noisy would start walking and clump, clump, clump he would go. Next day, Mr. Noisy and Mrs. Crumbs and Mr. Bacon. Remember Mrs. Crumbs from the bakery where he buys the bread and Mr. Bacon from where he buys the meat. So they met in the street and they said, oh my God, every morning, I feel so petrified, so scared, and I'm shaking and shivering when Mr. Noisy comes to the store. What should we do? And then Mrs. Crumbs had a plan. You know what she did? She whispered in Mr. Bacon's ear. Mr. Bacon smiled and said, that plan could possibly work. Let's do this. And then next morning, again the same thing happened. Mr. Noisy is going shopping to buy himself a loaf of bread and going clump, 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 clump and open the door. Wow! Boom! And gets inside the store and then says in his voice, I would like a loaf of bread. Mrs. Crumbs just smiled and said, sorry, what did you say? Pretending she hasn't heard him. Mr. Noisy looked like that and then said even louder, I would like a loaf of bread. Mrs. Crumbs looked like that. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't quite hear that. What is it that you want, Mr. Noisy? Mr. Noisy looked puzzled and then still said, I'll give it another shot and said, I would like a loaf of bread. Can't hear you, Mr. Noisy. Could you possibly repeat yourself? By now, Mr. Noisy was tired. And he said, oh my God. He just walked out of the store, banging the door and just walked. Let me go buy myself some meat. Maybe I'll just have that since Mrs. Crumbs can't hear me today. Went to Mr. Bacon's shop and said in his voice, I would like a piece of meat. Mr. Bacon smiled and said, "What did you say? Did you say something? I didn't quite hear it." Mr. Noisy was puzzled, but he wanted to give it another try and said, "I said I would like a piece of meat." "I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear that." Mr. Noisy said, "What is wrong with people?" He just gave up and he went home. He went back home. He went to bed hungry because there was no bread. There was nothing. Poor Mr. Noisy. And then they met again, Mrs. Crumbs and Mr. Bacon in the market. And they said, how was it? And they laughed at what Mr. Noisy had done. And then they said, we have to keep up with it. We have to keep up with it. Next day morning, the same thing. Clump, 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 clump. And bum, bum into Mrs. Crumb's store. And then saying, "A loaf of." Then he stopped and he said, uh, in a normal voice, "I would like a loaf of bread, Mrs. Crumb." Mrs. Crumb smiled and said, "Certainly," and gave him a loaf of bread. Then Mr. Noisy went to Mr. Bacon's shop. "I would like a piece of meat." "Did you say something, Mr. Noisy?" said Mr. Bacon. "Yes, I did. I said "Oh, okay, maybe that's not the way to talk." Then he said quietly, uh, "I would like a piece of meat, Mr. Bacon." Mr. Bacon smiled and said, "My pleasure. I will surely give you what you want." And then he gave him. Then Mr. Noisy, carrying the bread and the meat, set off home. Clump, clump, clump. Just when he was climbing the hill, he stopped and thought to himself, maybe I can do it in another way. And he tiptoed. Something that Mr. Noisy had never done in his life. He tiptoed. Tip, tip, tip. He walked. Not so bad. Mr. Noisy arrived at his house, opened the door, and then just as he was about to bang it, he held it and shut the door very gently. This is fun too. I don't necessarily have to keep shouting. And then, do you know something? From then on until today, Mr. Noisy is not noisy like how he was before. And do you know something else? The people of Wobbletown are delighted, especially Mrs. Crumb and Mr. Bacon. And do you know something else? Mr. Noisy has learned how to whisper. Thank you. So, did you like the story? So, let's do something today. Let's not be Mr. Noisy. We all have to stay inside the house, right? So, our parents might get upset. So, let's not be noisy. How about if we spend our day talking in whispers? "Mom, I'm hungry. Mom, can you give me something to eat?" Or whatever it is that you want to tell your parents. Let's not talk in our normal voice today. We'll be the second Mr. The second Mr. Noisy, who actually became Mr. Quiet. So we'll be soft and talk in whispers. All right, tell me, how did you like the story? Show Jungle Book some love. And I love all of you. I think you all are so wonderful who spend time listening to the story. And thank you to your parents who are making the effort to do this. And I look forward to seeing all of you again on Friday, same time at 11 o'clock, with another Mr. Story. All right. Oh, before I sign off, virtual hug to all of you. Take care, stay safe, stay in your house, stay safe. Bye bye.